Some quick theory, right? And this is one of the ones that's like, there's so much. But I was trying to, identify some things that were very applicable, in my opinion, to green socialist organizing. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, like I said earlier, Joe Freeman, is a must read. Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a top 5 read for me and for every socialist. It really gives a great foundation to think about, how does power work? How does oppression work? How do we build an actual alternative to this? And yeah, it's largely framed within the context of education, but its application is pretty boundless. It's not given anywhere near it shouldn't be considered a niche education theory book. It should be considered an organizing manual and a leftist, centerpiece. We talked about African liberation movements. Frantz Fanon, Voices of Liberation is like Wretched of the Earth is a popular Fanon, right? That's more theory. Voices of Liberation is like a recollection of his life, right? It's interviews, it's articles, it's it gives a good view of the life and the movement and the thoughts of a revolutionary African socialist. Ecosocialism by Michael Howie is one of the main books that I'll often see on ecosocialism, and it's small, right? I think my copy's actually downstairs, but it's another one of those 100-pagers, not very big. We talked about Bookchin, right? There's so much Bookchin that's applicable to our movement.
Yeah. That one particular is focused on municipalist ideas that we have covered already, and a lot of that fed into the early Green Party's key values and stuff too. So it's Bookchin wrote a lot, but that's probably a great starting place.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, or like the principles of social ecology are another key one, right? So Bookchin's one of those people. There's a bunch to read. Michel Foucault, Power, Sexuality, Gender is not the name of the book. It's kind of issues that he delves into. His book Discipline Power is great, right? When I was a community organizer, I was knocking doors in a working class mixed race neighborhood in my town, and I knocked on a door, and a young 20-something black man answered the door, and I was supposed to have a conversation like 2 to 5 minutes, and I talked to him for an hour. But I was the boss, so I was okay to do that. My job was actually the people that in 2 to 5 minutes warranted an hour, I would come. But I happened to get him, and we spent an hour talking about power, right? And this young man articulated ideas about power and where it resides in ways that would make you think that he was well read on Michel Foucault. But he doesn't, he's just talking from experience, right? Living as a working class black man, right? In one of the most segregated cities in the country. And on top of his card that we filled out, I actually wrote Foucault and doesn't know it, right? Foucault's work on, oh my God, I can't think of it, on prisons. I can't think of the word, but basically on self-policing is really, really powerful. And then he was an early influential person on sexuality and gender. I talked about Guy Debord earlier, right, when in our kind of post-Marxist ramp up from Gramsci to Horkheimer to Guy Debord. Guy Debord was a situationist. He was part of the situationist movement. The situationists believe that, like, rather than engaging in an ongoing revolution, right, that you wait, kind of like Carbondale Spring did, right, in the story I told earlier, that you wait and that capitalism will provide moments of weakness when you can give a good kick. And so the situationists were one of the main kind of thinkers behind the May-June 1968 riots in Paris. One of these things that, like, it seemed like it just popped off out of nowhere and then it disappeared. And the situationists like Guy Debord at the time were, said, well, a weakness was shown, a crack in the glass was shown, and we had to hit it. And, they shut down Paris for 2 months, basically. But his Society of the Spectacle makes it's written really interesting way, really digestible and short, but it gets into like the idea that when you ask someone what capitalism is, they give you a myth, they tell you a story, and it's not based in reality, right? That with the world we live in and the world we perceive are different things, and we need to grapple with that. Kind of on a similar thing, Abby Hoffman's Revolution of the Hell for the Hell of It. I think Greens and independent socialists have a lot to learn from the Yippies and their theatrics and their ability to see that point, kind of like the Situationists, right? To see that point of weakness and to hit it. My favorite Yippie story is when they were going to levitate the Pentagon. They went to the Pentagon and they were holding hands, and they'd like walk from one end to the other. And obviously, military police came out and they said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're seeing how many hippies it takes to encircle the Pentagon, holding hands." And they were like, "Okay, we'll come inside and talk to us." So then they laid out this whole plan that they were going to encircle the Pentagon, and they were going to have, people from, religious leaders from all different religions there, and they were going to levitate the Pentagon into the air, and they were going to excise the demons from it. And the Pentagon gave them a permit to do so that stipulated that the Pentagon would rise no more than 1 foot off of the ground. Like, you're doing something right if the government makes that joke, right? And then the picture of the girl putting the flower in that's from the levitation of the Pentagon, right? So they had a swagger and an attitude within the movement, within the anti-war movement, within the civil rights movement, that I think we have a lot to learn from, right? I think we could, we always talk about how do we get people to pay attention. The Yippies knew how to get people to pay attention. And they also had great politics, right? When Occupy started, I was part of a group called the Radical Student Union. And we showed up at a meeting, and we started handing out buttons, and they had a red star and they said leader. And everyone said, and we got this idea from Abby Hoffman and the Yippies. They did this during the anti-war movement. And, people we'd give them to people, and they would say, Occupy was real big on, we don't have leaders. And they said, I'm not the leader. We don't have leaders. And we'd explain to them, we're all leaders. And if we're all wearing the buttons, we're all leaders, right? And it was a way to start that conversation. So they were really good at that kind of, for lack of a better word, PR organizing that we can learn from. Sun Tzu and the Art of War, like, seriously, y'all, if you haven't read this and aren't applying it to your politics, I don't know what you're doing. And actually, I know that a lot of people haven't, and a lot of people aren't, right? Because there are times when I'm like, have you never read this? Like, do you have no idea that you shouldn't go into a battle that you're going to lose, right? Or the idea of, going into a struggle and making sure that the conditions are right for you, doing everything you can to have the right conditions for victory. Yes, it's about war, but like it can be very much applied to politics. And it's simple, and it's thousands of years old, and it's still very, very much relevant. A Thousand Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari has really good ideas to contribute about what's called rhizomal or horizontal revolution. An example of this that I would give would be the Arab Spring, right? When you looked at it from the West, right, most people thought that all of a sudden, like, these things just started happening, and it was like miraculous and spontaneous. But the reality, and then they weren't connected, right? They were independent of each other. And the reality is, one that we don't talk about is that the movements that kicked off the Arab Spring have been brewing for decades, right? The Arab Spring was just that situationist moment when they could pop off. So Egypt didn't just happen. People have been working to make Egypt happen for a long time. But a rhizomal revolution comes with an understanding that, kind of like asparagus, the conditions, the common conditions of oppression under capitalism, oppression under neocolonialism, right, are everything that the people of Northern Africa and the Middle East were dealing with at the time is spreading like an undercurrent underground. And then, like asparagus, right, it pops up randomly at break points. And so that's why it's called rhizomal revolution, because that rhizomes grow underground and then shoot up. So I think that's a really important idea for Greens to understand, right? Because we want to harness that. The common conditions are there. They manifest in unique ways locally, but the common conditions are there. So we need to understand how to, best activate them and best, see where our opportunities are. And then the last one I have on this is Hatred of Democracy by Jacques Rancière. This one, another very short book, and it lays out a blistering critique of liberalism, to the point that, like, you finish the book and you go, when you look, living here in the United States, like living in Illinois, where to run for Congress as a Republican or a Democrat in my district, I have to collect 750 signatures, but to run as a Green, I have to collect 15,000. Right? The hatred, and this is a deep blue Democrat-ran state, right? The people who put that in place are the Democrats. So it's not really hard for me to imagine that the Democratic Party is fundamentally opposed to democracy. But that's because of kind of the realistic conditions I see on the ground. Rancière's book takes it to like a fundamental theoretical level, that liberalism, neoliberalism, traditional liberalism, whatever, capitalist liberalism is fundamentally opposed to any kind of democracy, and that the Western democracies that are lauded in academia are actually a farce and anti-democratic to their core, which I think is a good thing for Greens and Socialists to kind of understand.